about 2300 BC and you are living in ancient Mesopotamia. It is the first day of the month of Sivan, and we have a lot to get done. So let's start your day with some history. The current king of Sumer is Amarites. He's been ruling since sometime in the 26th century BC. You don't know how long because nobody knows what happened between the Akkadian Empire falling and this guy taking the throne. Records were kept on clay tablets and there was a bit of a gap where those records got damaged. Scholars believe that perhaps there were several kingdoms that ruled over Sumer in this period. But the people just remember the Akkadians followed by the Sumerians. So it's kind of a lost age in history. Kind of like that episode of Friends where everybody forgets Ross's wife's name, or when Rachel gets amnesia and doesn't remember she's married to Ross. It's a real head scratcher. Now Amarit's father, Lugal-Kinishedu, came from the neighboring kingdom of Lagash. Before he took the throne of Sumer, he had actually built his own empire that stretched all the way to the Persian Gulf. That would be pretty impressive if it wasn't right next door to another guy who was doing the exact same thing. Shuruppak, the king of Akkad, was expanding his empire farther south than any Mesopotamian ruler before him. The two of them became fierce rivals, and in the 18th year of Shurupak's rule, they went to war. We don't know much about the conflict except for the result. Shuruppak was defeated, and the tide of Mesopotamian power permanently shifted south. Now Lugal-Kinishara didn't stop at restoring Sumerian power. He pushed even farther south and claimed the city of Umma for himself. Now this was bad news for the small city of Lagash. See, Lagash was an important trading partner of Umma. But with the two cities now under the same ruler, Lagash's access to the sea was cut off. And that meant they could no longer trade with the mysterious land of Dilmun. We don't know exactly where Dilmun was. Most historians believe it was either Bahrain or the eastern coast of Saudi Arabia. What we do know is that they traded things like incense, wine and elephant tusks. But the only way to get there was through Umma. Without Umma as an intermediary, the trade with Dilmun was cut off and Lugal-Kinishara was cut off from making lots of money. And here you thought you had problems. Well, you may not have had to pay taxes to the king or go to war, but life for the average Mesopotamian was still pretty rough. Your house might have been made out of sun-baked bricks, but that didn't mean it was gonna stay that way. Floods were common in Mesopotamia, and it wasn't unheard of for a house to be completely destroyed in a single night. And when I say destroyed, I don't mean that the roof leaked and the paint was chipping. I mean that the whole structure collapsed. This would have been especially dangerous if you lived in a multi-story building. In fact, archaeologists found evidence that many buildings were destroyed so often that they were built atop the rubble of older buildings. They were called ziggurat houses, and they looked kind of like mini pyramids. When you needed to fix your house after a flood, you wouldn't call a repairman because there was no such thing as a professional handyman. Repair work would be done either by members of your family or by slaves. Slavery was a big part of life in Mesopotamia. Prisoners of war were taken as slaves and forced to work for no money. If you were born into slavery, your status was determined by your gender. Female slaves could work in the home cleaning or cooking, while male slaves were put to work on building projects or in the fields. Slaves didn't have any rights and could be bought, sold or inherited. Speaking of the fields, it was time to plant some grain. Farming was the main occupation in Mesopotamia, but it was also one of the riskiest professions. There were several factors that determined whether or not the crops would grow. The weather needed to be warm but not too hot. There couldn't be any floods, but there also couldn't be any droughts. Plus, there was always the risk that some roving band of nomads would come through and plunder your crops. You never knew what to expect in Mesopotamia. If you were a farmer, you probably grew barley, wheat and dates. Dates were grown along the riverbanks, while wheat and barley were planted farther away from the water. Farmers used a type of plow pulled by oxen to turn over the soil. Then they would use a tool called a seed drill to make rows in the soil. After that, they would take the seeds and toss them into the drill. Finally, it was time to wait. The farmers of Mesopotamia worked hard for several months during the planting and harvesting seasons. But most of the year they had very little to show for their efforts. That's why many farmers supplemented their diet with fish. Fishing was another popular pastime in Mesopotamia, and you could eat fish year-round thanks to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. As a kid growing up in Mesopotamia, you probably spent most of your time playing with other children in your neighborhood. There weren't many toys to play with, so most games were improvised. Kids played with balls made of rags, and they invented games similar to hide and seek and tag. When they weren't playing outside, they were learning how to read and write. Education was highly valued in Mesopotamian culture, and both boys and girls attended school. The only difference was that girls learned how to read and write at home, while boys were sent off to a special school building. At school, boys would learn how to read and write, but they were also taught math, astronomy, and medicine. The instructors were usually older men who had retired from their jobs as scribes. Scribes were an important part of society. They were the ones who recorded important information on clay tablets. Because they were responsible for keeping records, scribes were generally higher on the societal rungs than most other professions. When you grew up and started your career, you probably ended up being a scribe. After all, writing was a super useful skill, and there weren't too many other careers to choose from. There were merchants who traveled around trading goods, but most people were either farmers or laborers. Laborers were the lowest class in Mesopotamian society, and their jobs were pretty undesirable. Laborers were often tasked with digging canals or building projects. They also worked as domestic servants for wealthier people, and sometimes they were forced to work on building projects for the king. Building projects is how the ziggurats got built. A ziggurat was a type of pyramid-like temple tower that was dedicated to a specific deity. Each city would have its own ziggurat, and it was considered a holy place where people could commune with the gods. The most famous ziggurat was the one built in the city of Ur. It was 70 feet tall and had 3 levels. It was also the inspiration for the Tower of Babel story in the Bible. After a long day of working on the ziggurat, you might want to visit the baths and get cleaned up. Baths were a popular way to relax in Mesopotamia, and public bathhouses were common throughout the cities. Going to the baths was a social event, and people would spend hours there chatting and catching up with each other. Some bathhouses even had restaurants attached to them, so you could get a nice meal along with your scrub and massage. While in the bath, you could cover your body with fragrant oils or flowers. This was a special treat for most people, but for someone like Gilgamesh, it was a way of life. Gilgamesh was the legendary king of Uruk. He reigned somewhere between 2100 and 1800 BC. That makes him one of the first historical figures we've encountered. He was the inspiration for the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest pieces of literature ever discovered. The story goes that Gilgamesh was a tyrant who ruled over his people with an iron fist. His days consisted of taxing his people, forcing them to build huge walls around the city and having affairs. But one day he became sick and realized that he was not immortal, like he had always believed. So he went on a quest to find the secret of immortality. He didn't find what he was looking for, but he did make a friend named Enkidu. The two of them had many adventures together, but eventually they parted ways and Gilgamesh returned to Uruk. By the end of the epic, Gilgamesh accepts his mortality and realizes that his legacy will live on through the great city of Uruk. Click here to watch more boring history videos.